Contrary to common assumption, during the era of gunpowder, very few cannons were discovered on European battlefields. It took over 300 years before artillery lived up to its full potential against strong fortifications and experienced enemy armies, despite the fact that it had become a crucial component of European combat by the middle of the 15th century. In fact, the usage of cannons actually declined during the 16th century. Limited battlefield effectiveness was not the reason for this delay. When cannons were first used, they destroyed opposing formations, and soon after, they did the same to medieval walls. The problem was that engineers quickly created strongholds that could withstand their bombardments as a response. Soon, the cannons of the era were unable to keep up with the construction of these so-called bastion forts throughout Europe. The heavy and few cannons first only partially demonstrated their value in field combat as well. Generals in the 16th and 17th centuries frequently took only a small number of pieces to the battlefield, whereas Napoleon was able to bring an astounding 700 pieces to Leipzig in 1813. This begs the question of precisely when, how, and why artillery joined infantry and cavalry as a third branch of the military. Artillery could be used against medieval fortress walls with considerable success by the middle of the 15th century. It was essential to many events, such as the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, when roughly 70 Ottoman guns hammered the renowned Theodosian walls, leaving extensive sections of them laced with breaches, the Spanish reconquest of Granada in 1492, and the French reconquest of Normandy in the late Hundred Years' War. However, artillery was still but one instrument among many, and it did not dominate European battles. Great caution is suggested even though several sources from the late Middle Ages and early modern era attest to the tremendous power of the many guns employed in siege campaigns. According to historian Simon Pepper, we shouldn't blindly trust these reports because there are many other sources that do, in fact, document a persistent lack of firearms, artillery, and ammunition. Furthermore, the figures provided by several sites appear to be deceptive. For instance, current sources typically place the number of French siege cannons that besieged Naples at the start of the Italian Wars in 1494 to 1595 at 36. Of these 36, however, only 8 or 9 were big cannons, 4 were light guns, and the remainder were even smaller gunpowder weapons like handguns and basic arquebuses. The League of Cambrai's collection of 60 genuine cannons during the siege of Padua in 1509 paints a similar, albeit skewed, image. However, because they had to be dragged there from Innsbruck, Milan, and Ferrara, the majority of these 60 cannons only made there at the end of the siege. Overall, a detailed examination of the data for the 15th century reveals that huge cannons, ammunition, and powder were either constantly in low supply or came late because of the costly and time-consuming transportation. After a century or so, the situation hasn't really changed. Fewer cannons than intended or specified in the sources made it to their target during numerous wars or sieges. For instance, in 1552, Emperor Charles V made a great effort to retake Metz by bringing heavy cannons from all over the Rhineland, and he was able to muster 50 pieces. The majority of the heavy guns, however, arrived too late here as well. In a region of Europe that was well-connected, heavily urbanized, proto-industrialized, and abundantly supplied with cannon builders, it is evident that even the Holy Roman Emperor struggled to raise 50 guns. John Gielmartin, who has researched the Ottoman campaign against Malta in 1565, notes that both the Ottomans and the island's defenders experienced a persistent lack of heavy cannons and ammunition. Simon Pepper claims that the Italian city-states and France faced comparable challenges. He said that there was a shortage of artillery during the 16th century, both on land and in Mediterranean Sea naval combat. Things haven't altered much in another 100 years. According to David Parrott, a specialist in the French army of the era, the French force in Italy in 1638 numbered between 9,000 and 10,000 infantrymen, 3,000 cavalrymen, and 5 guns. This stands in sharp contrast to the 90 cannons that the renowned Gustavus Adolphus's Swedish army possessed in Bavaria in 1632. This, however, can be explained by Gustavus's recent army reforms, which included the introduction of lighter field cannons that mostly discharged shotgun-like grape shot. However, there is still a huge difference. Gustavus Adolphus was unique in Europe in that he was the first to use artillery extensively in field combat. All things considered, the demand for heavy artillery grew far more quickly than its supply. According to Parrott, this is explained by the tripartite requirement that ships, fortifications, and soldiers all have firearms. Cardinal Richelieu's expanding Atlantic fleet in France was the biggest user of recently cast cannons in Parrott's field of research. There, few of the French victories of the period were brought to a conclusion because artillery bombardment had rendered the defenses untenable due to a lack of cannons. In addition to restricting those who besieged a city, the absence of guns denied field forces a possible advantage. Battles could not be won by artillery alone, but it could disintegrate and destroy enemy formations, providing friendly infantry and cavalry with a significant advantage or compelling an undecided opponent to engage in combat. Long-term bombardment of an enemy army was unaffordable. Actually, it might have attacked or withdrew in order to avoid the artillery fire. Simon Pepper claims that in the early modern era, artillery was typically used to force the enemy army to move since it prevented expensive attacks on fortified positions. With a range of up to 915 meters, 1,000 yards, the greatest artillery could cause significant harm at even farther ranges via so-called ricochet shots, in which the ball bounced and rolled over solid ground. A bloody path could be cut through a thick arrangement by even a cannonball that rolls rather slowly. Our movie on artillery tactics and its role in European armies is a must-watch for anybody interested in the subject. It's now on the information card. It wasn't until the late 17th century that France's heavy artillery deficiency was resolved. The impact of the famous engineer Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban on French warfare has been examined by historian Jamel Oswald, who discovered that by that time, nearly every kind of artillery was at last more widely available. In order to break sieges faster and maybe save lives and money, commanders now depend more and more on firepower. According to Oswald's analysis of 25 sieges from 1697 to 1712, the attackers employed an average of 64 heavy cannons and 34 mortars, for a total of 98 weapons. In sharp contrast, the French crown took 42 large cannons and field serpents to the first siege of La Rochelle in 1572-1573 as part of their greatest offensive against the Huguenots. It becomes evident how many more guns were accessible by 1700, a good century later, when one considers that the operation at La Rochelle used twice as many cannons as the second largest operation in the early 1570s. Similar circumstances existed in Spain, where major artillery employment occurred for the first time during the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1715. Guns were not only utilized far more frequently, but they also took on a more significant and active role. For instance, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, assembled multiple huge batteries with well over 40 cannons in the Second Battle of Blenheim in 1704, one of the war's most significant engagements. 50 years prior, this number would have been unthinkable. Keeping his cavalry in the rear to administer the final blow following the barrage, he positioned them to fire a thick barrage on what he believed to be the engagement's main region. 2 years later, in the Battle of Ramillies, another significant engagement of the same conflict, even more artillery was used: 120 English guns and 70 French cannons. Once more, these figures pale in contrast to the batteries deployed during the 7 Years' War. Frederick the Great persisted in promoting the use of artillery, and batteries expanded into entire gun parks under Napoleon, who had formerly been a gunner. Depending on the source, 700 of his cannons and 915 to 1,500 of his opponent's guns engaged in combat at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. At last, the era of massed artillery had arrived. Logistical challenges and a general shortage of heavy weapons were two of the main causes of the postponed use of artillery. These issues couldn't be adequately addressed until cannon production was sufficiently organized and professionalized. The centralization of cannon production was first introduced by England and the Netherlands, but France found it especially difficult because its cannon foundries were dispersed throughout the northern provinces, had small capacities, and were privately owned. There weren't even enough cannons for the Navy, which Richelieu attempted to equip with the firearms that were available. In fact, there were so few guns that ships entering French harbors were frequently stripped of their cannon, so that they might be mounted on departing ships. As a result, Richelieu's fleet of seaworthy ships was far greater than his number of combat-ready ships. However, throughout the 17th and even into the 18th centuries, the majority of other European nations continued to struggle with the production of cannons. Manufacturing was challenging and resources were few, particularly for new nations like Prussia. For instance, in 1717, Frederick William I, the first king of Prussia, constructed a powder mill and an arms factory close to Spandau. But he had to import costly materials from other nations, including iron, tin, lead, and mechanical components. Between 1741 and 1762, the Royal Powder Factory and private manufacturers manufactured roughly 1,500 cannons, which is a lot, but not quite enough to meet the demands of combat in the 18th century. Prussia had to keep importing firearms from Sweden despite significant efforts to establish an independent production. In conclusion, the ongoing lack of cannons can be explained, at least in part, by logistical and technological issues that were not resolved until the late 17th century in most locations. Artillery wasn't really effective until the 18th century, when it was able to be utilized in big quantities. Artillery might then be utilized against contemporary, well-constructed star fortresses, or dependably used into a sophisticated war strategy. At last, it had solidified its position as the third military branch on par with infantry and cavalry.